A cold wind howled through the valley as 15-year-old Julia Zimmerman stood trembling beside her father on the wooden porch of their modest homestead outside Golden, Colorado. The year was 1875, and her life was about to change forever. Her father, with calloused hands and a desperate heart, had just signed away her future to a man 3 times her age, a wealthy cattle baron with a reputation as cruel as the winter that had claimed her mother's life just months before. "You'll learn to be grateful, girl," her father muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Horace Blackwell will provide what I cannot. This drought has taken everything. We've no choice." Julia's tears froze against her cheeks as she watched her father accept a pouch of coins from the gray-haired man with cold eyes who would soon become her husband. In the distance, a lone figure on horseback watched from the ridge a young cowboy whose heart ached at the scene unfolding before him. That cowboy was Fitzgerald, barely 20 himself, who had been working cattle on neighboring ranches since he was 12. He had spoken to Julia only a handful of times at church socials and town gatherings, but something about her quiet strength and the dreams she whispered of seeing the world beyond Golden had captured his imagination. Now, watching her future being bartered away, he made a silent vow beneath the vast Colorado sky. The wedding was a grim affair held in the Blackwell mansion the following Sunday. Julia wore her mother's altered dress, her small frame drowning in fabric that smelled of mothballs and broken promises. Her hands shook as she recited vows she didn't understand, to a man whose breath reeked of whiskey and whose fingers dug painfully into her arm when the preacher pronounced them man and wife. That night, when Blackwell approached her in the bedroom that was now hers, he found her curled into herself, shaking uncontrollably. "I may be many things, girl," he said gruffly, surprising her as he stepped back, "but I'm not a complete monster. I'll give you time. But remember, you're my wife now, and eventually you'll fulfill your duties." He slept in a separate bedroom that night and the next, and for many nights thereafter. Julia was instead tasked with managing the household, learning to oversee the servants and appearing as the perfect, dutiful wife when Blackwell entertained business associates. Her youth and beauty were ornaments for his status, nothing more. 2 years passed this way. Julia grew from a frightened child into a young woman of 17, learning to navigate the constraints of her gilded cage. Blackwell's patience had begun to wear thin, his comments becoming more pointed about her wifely obligations still unfulfilled. It was on a crisp autumn morning when Julia was in town purchasing supplies that she quite literally collided with Fitzgerald outside the general store. "Miss Julia," he said, steadying her with gentle hands before correcting himself. "Mrs. Blackwell, I mean." "Mr. Fitzgerald," she replied formally, though her heart raced at the unexpected encounter. She had seen him occasionally from afar during her rare trips into town, but they had not spoken since before her marriage. "May I help you with those packages?" he offered, nodding toward the heavy parcels she carried. "My driver is just across the street," she declined politely. "But thank you for the offer." Finn nodded, his eyes holding hers a moment longer than propriety allowed. "I've been meaning to speak with you, actually. I'm looking for experienced help for my ranch." "Your ranch?" Julia's surprise was evident. The Finn she remembered had been a hired hand, not a property owner. "Yes, madam, purchased the old Hargrove place last spring. It's modest, but it's mine." Pride colored his voice. "I heard your father's been having a rough time since." "Well, since you left." Julia's chest tightened. Her father had refused all offers of financial assistance from Blackwell, choosing instead to drink away his guilt and what little money remained. She hadn't spoken to him since her wedding day. "I've hired him on," Finn continued quietly. He's working for me now, not much, just enough to keep him busy and get him back on his feet. Tears pricked at Julia's eyes, but she blinked them away. That's very kind of you, Mr. Fitzgerald. Finn, he corrected gently. And it's not kindness. He's a good worker when he stays sober. I've made sure of that part. A sharp call from across the street interrupted them, her driver signaling impatience. I should go, Julia said reluctantly. Of course. Finn touched the brim of his hat. It was good seeing you, Julia. As she turned to leave, he added softly, I'm out at the North Ridge property most days. If you ever need anything at all, that's where you can find me. Something in his tone made her pause and look back, but Finn had already turned away, disappearing into the general store. That brief encounter planted a seed of hope in Julia's heart that she hadn't dared nurture before. Someone remembered her. Someone saw her as Julia, not merely as Blackwell's property. The knowledge sustained her through the increasingly difficult days that followed. Winter came early that year, harsh and unforgiving. Blackwell's drinking worsened with the cold, and his temper with it. The grace period of Julia's marriage was clearly coming to an end. He had begun to make more aggressive advances, cornering her in hallways, making threats about what would happen if she didn't soon become a proper wife. One night, as the first major blizzard of the season howled outside, Blackwell stumbled into Julia's bedroom, reeking of whiskey and rage. You've had your time, he slurred, advancing on her. More than generous I've been, too generous. Julia backed away until she hit the wall. Please, Horace, you're drunk. Let's talk in the morning. No more talking, he growled, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. You're my wife, mine. What happened next occurred in a blur. As he lunged for her, Julia's hand closed around a heavy silver hairbrush on her dressing table. She swung it without thinking, connecting with his temple. Blackwell staggered backward, more surprised than hurt, before his face contorted with fury. You'll regret that, he snarled and lunged again. Julia ducked under his arm and ran. Down the hallway, down the stairs, pausing only to grab her woolen cloak from the hook by the door before plunging into the blinding snow. She had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to escape. The wind cut through her nightgown like knives, snow immediately soaking through her thin house slippers. Still, she pressed on, fighting through drifts that sometimes reached her knees. Behind her, she could hear Blackwell bellowing her name, the sounds growing fainter as distance and the howling wind separated them. She had no idea how long she walked, only that eventually her limbs grew heavy, her movements sluggish. The cold no longer bit. Instead, a dangerous warmth began to seep through her, tempting her to rest. Just for a moment, she thought, as she sank to her knees in the snow. Julia wasn't sure if she dreamed the sound of approaching hoofbeats or the strong arms that lifted her from the drift. Reality blurred, fragments of consciousness coming and going, the warmth of a horse beneath her, a solid chest at her back, a voice murmuring reassurances she couldn't quite make out. When she finally awoke fully, it was to the crackle of a hearth fire and the smell of coffee. She was wrapped in layers of thick blankets on a narrow bed in a small but tidy cabin. "You're safe now," came a familiar voice, and Julia turned to find Finn Fitzgerald watching her from a chair pulled up beside the bed. "Though you nearly froze to death getting here." "Here?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "My place," he explained. "I was checking on the livestock before the worst of the storm hit when I saw something moving out in the snow. Never expected to find you 1/2 mile from my door in a blizzard." Julia tried to sit up, memories flooding back. "Horace, he'll come looking for me. He'll be furious." "Let him be," Finn said with quiet certainty. "No man's riding anywhere in this storm, not even Blackwell. We've got at least 2 days before the pass is clear. Until then, you can decide what you want to do." What I want. The concept seemed foreign after years of having no choices at all. Yes, Julia, what you want. Finn's eyes were steady on hers. I won't pretend I haven't thought about you these past 2 years. Haven't worried about you, but whatever happens next has to be your choice. For the first time since she was 15, someone was offering Julia control over her own fate. The realization brought fresh tears to her eyes. I can't go back, she whispered. Not now, not ever. Finn nodded solemnly. Then you won't. But how? He's powerful, connected. The law will side with him. Let me worry about that, Finn said, standing to stoke the fire. For now, rest. Get warm. You're safe here, Julia. I promise you that. True to Finn's prediction, the blizzard raged for 2 full days. In that time, Julia recovered her strength and learned more about the man who had rescued her. Finn had been saving every penny since he was 14, determined to have land of his own. He'd finally purchased the small ranch the previous year, 200 acres, mostly unimproved, but with good water access and decent grazing. It's not much compared to Blackwell's empire, he admitted as they shared a simple dinner of venison stew, but it's mine, free and clear. It's wonderful, Julia said sincerely, looking around the small cabin he'd built with his own hands. Though simple, everything showed care and craftsmanship. You've accomplished so much at such a young age, Finn shrugged, a hint of color touching his cheeks. I've still got bigger plans. Another few years, I'll have enough saved to build a proper house. Something worthy of. He stopped abruptly, busying himself with his food. Worthy of what? Julia prompted. Of a family someday, he finished quietly, not meeting her eyes. The conversation shifted then, but Julia found herself watching Finn more closely. The boy she had known in passing years ago had grown into a man of quiet confidence and clear purpose. His hands were calloused from hard work, his skin weathered from long days under the Colorado sun, but his eyes remained kind, his manner gentle despite the strength evident in his tall frame. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. Julia stood at the cabin's single window, watching the sun transform the blanket of snow into a dazzling expanse of white. They'll be digging out the roads today, Finn said, coming to stand beside her. By tomorrow, travel will be possible again. Julia's heart sank. And Blackwell will come looking for me. Yes, Finn agreed simply. He hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about this, Julia. There might be a way out for you, but it won't be easy. Tell me, she said, turning to face him fully, the railroad. A friend of mine works the Denver line. There's a train heading east tomorrow afternoon all the way to St. Louis. From there, you could go anywhere. Hope and fear warred within her. Leave Colorado, but I've never. I don't have any money, Finn. No skills, no, I have savings, he interrupted. Enough to get you settled somewhere new. And you have more skills than you realize. You're smart, resourceful. Why would you do this for me? Julia asked, searching his face. Give me your savings. Risk Blackwell's wrath. Finn was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because on the day I watched your father sell you to Horace Blackwell, I made myself a promise. I promised that if I ever had a chance to right that wrong, I would. No matter the cost. His words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Julia found herself stepping closer to him, drawn by the sincerity in his voice and the intensity in his eyes. What if? She began hesitantly. What if I don't want to leave Colorado? Then you don't have to, he replied. But staying means facing Blackwell. He won't let you go easily. I know, she whispered, but running feels like letting him win, like I'll be running forever. Finn studied her face. What do you want to do, Julia? She took a deep breath. I want to fight for my freedom, for my life. Her voice grew stronger with each word. I've spent 2 years being afraid. I don't want to spend the rest anymore. A slow smile spread across Finn's face, admiration, respect, and something deeper shining in his eyes. "Then we fight," he said simply. That afternoon they formulated a plan. Julia would not hide from Blackwell, but neither would she return to him. Instead, she would seek refuge with the town's preacher and his wife, who maintained a small room for women in difficult situations. From there, she would petition for annulment of her marriage on grounds that it had never been consummated, a humiliating admission, but one that might grant her freedom. "Blackwell will fight it," Finn warned as they saddled his horse the next morning, preparing to ride into town. "He'll claim otherwise. It will be your word against his." "Then it's fortunate I have this," Julia said, withdrawing a small leather journal from the pocket of the dress Finn had procured for her from a neighboring ranch. "I've kept a diary since I was 12. Every day of my marriage is documented here, including Horace's agreement to wait and his increasing threats. It's not much, but it's evidence," Finn finished, his expression brightening. "Julia, that's brilliant." The journey into Golden was tense but uneventful. As expected, signs of search parties were evident: men on horseback, combing the areas where the snow had sufficiently melted. They avoided the main roads, taking instead the less traveled paths that Finn knew well from his years working the surrounding ranches. Arriving at the church just as dusk fell, they were greeted by Pastor Reynolds and his wife, Martha, with concern but no judgment. The elderly couple had seen too much of frontier life to be easily shocked. "You'll be safe here, child," Martha assured Julia, leading her to a small but clean room at the back of their modest home. "The Lord knows your heart, and He sees your suffering." "Thank you," Julia whispered, overwhelmed by the woman's kindness. "I'll be back tomorrow," Finn promised as he prepared to leave. "I need to check on your father, make sure he's all right. Then we'll visit Judge Wilson and file the annulment petition." "Be careful," Julia urged, suddenly afraid for him. "Horace has men everywhere." "I've lived in these hills my whole life," Finn reminded her with a gentle smile. "I know how to move without being seen." Still, as she watched him disappear into the gathering darkness, a sense of foreboding settled over Julia. She had drawn Finn into her troubles, possibly putting him in danger. The thought kept her awake long into the night, despite her exhaustion. Morning brought no relief to her anxiety. Julia paced the small room, jumping at every sound, expecting Blackwell or his men to appear at any moment. When a knock finally came at her door shortly before noon, she nearly cried out in alarm. "Julia, dear," called Martha's gentle voice, "you have a visitor." "A Mr. Fitzgerald." Relief flooded through her as she opened the door to find Finn standing there, hat in hand, looking tired but unharmed. "You're safe," she breathed. "Told you I would be," he replied with a small smile. "Are you ready? Judge Wilson agreed to see us at 1 o'clock. The walk to the judge's home office was the most exposed Julia had felt since her escape. Golden was a small town, barely 2,000 souls, and news traveled fast. Already she could feel eyes following them, whispers spreading in their wake. Blackwell's young wife, running away with a ranch hand. The scandal was too juicy to ignore. Judge Wilson was a stern man with a reputation for fairness. He listened impassively as Julia presented her case, occasionally glancing at the journal she had offered as evidence. Finn stood quietly supportive at her side, speaking only when directly addressed. "This is highly irregular," the judge finally said, closing the journal with a sigh. "Mr. Blackwell is an influential man in this county." "Yes, Your Honor," Julia acknowledged, her heart sinking. "But does his influence outweigh justice?" The judge raised an eyebrow at her boldness. "No, Mrs. Blackwell, it does not. However, I cannot simply grant an annulment based solely on your word, journal or no journal. There must be a hearing. Mr. Blackwell must have the opportunity to respond to these allegations. When? Finn asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. I can schedule it for next Monday, the judge replied. 4 days from now. 4 days. Julia felt dizzy at the prospect of facing Horace so soon, but she nodded her acceptance. Thank you, Your Honor. As they left the judge's office, the bright afternoon sun momentarily blinded them. Perhaps that was why they didn't immediately notice the 3 men waiting beside a black carriage across the street. There she is, shouted a familiar voice. Samuel Reed, Blackwell's foreman. Grab her. What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. 2 men rushed toward them while Reed remained by the carriage, hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. Finn immediately stepped in front of Julia, pushing her back toward the judge's door. Run, he commanded, but before Julia could move, the men were upon them. The first grabbed for Finn, who ducked the attempt and delivered a solid punch to the man's midsection. The second lunged for Julia, managing to catch her arm in a bruising grip. She cried out, struggling against him. The commotion drew attention quickly. Townsfolk stopped to stare, and from inside his office, Judge Wilson appeared in the doorway. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. Reed stepped forward, removing his hat in a show of respect. Begging your pardon, Judge. We're here on Mr. Blackwell's authority to retrieve his wife. She's been missing since the blizzard. We feared she was dead until word reached us she'd been seen in town. Missing, yes, Julia called out, still trying to wrench free of her captor. Because I fled for my life, Mrs. Blackwell has filed a petition for annulment, the judge informed Reed coldly. Until that matter is resolved, she is free to reside wherever she chooses. Reed's expression darkened. With all due respect, Judge, a wife's place is with her husband. The law allows exceptions when there are concerns for safety, the judge countered. Release her immediately, or I'll have the sheriff arrest you for assault. For a tense moment, Reed seemed to consider his options. Then, with obvious reluctance, he nodded to the man holding Julia. The bruising grip loosened, and she stumbled backward into Finn's steadying arms. This isn't over, Reed warned, his eyes boring into Julia's. Mr. Blackwell won't take kindly to such public humiliation. Tell Horace I'll see him in court, Julia replied, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. As Reed and his men retreated to their carriage, Judge Wilson turned to Julia and Finn. I suggest you both find somewhere safe to stay until the hearing. Blackwell won't take this lying down. My father's old cabin, Finn suggested. It's remote, defensible, and the last place they'd look. The judge nodded grimly. Go now while they're still in town. I'll send word when it's time for the hearing. Within the hour, Julia and Finn were riding double on his horse, headed deep into the foothills west of Golden. The old trapper's cabin that had once belonged to Finn's father stood in a sheltered valley, nestled among pines, and hidden from casual observation. No one's used it in years, Finn explained as they approached the small structure. Not since my father died, but I've kept it maintained. The cabin was indeed weathertight, if dusty from disuse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furnishings, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed filled the single room. Finn quickly set about building a fire while Julia shook out the old quilt stored in a cedar chest. We should be safe here, he said once the fire was crackling merrily. I'll need to go hunting tomorrow. We'll need food for the next few days. Julia nodded, a sudden wave of exhaustion washing over her as the tension of the day caught up with her. She sank onto the edge of the bed, hands trembling slightly. Finn knelt before her, gently taking her hands in his. Hey, he said softly, you were incredible today, standing up to Reed to the judge. Your courage is He shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. "I don't feel very courageous," Julia admitted. "I'm terrified, Finn. What if Horace convinces the judge? What if I have to go back?" "You won't," he said with quiet certainty. "I won't let that happen." Their eyes met in the flickering firelight, and something shifted between them. The connection that had been building since their reunion in the blizzard crystallized into something undeniable. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Finn leaned forward. His lips touched hers with infinite gentleness, a question, not a demand. Julia answered by leaning into the kiss, her hands moving to rest against his chest. For a moment, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only this: the warmth of the fire, the security of Finn's presence, and the surprising rightness of his kiss. When they finally parted, Finn rested his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady. "I've wanted to do that since you were 16, he confessed quietly. "Why didn't you?" She whispered. "Because you weren't ready." His answer was simple, direct. "And then because you belonged to someone else." "I never belonged to him," Julia said fiercely. "Never, not in the ways that matter." Finn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Still, I needed to be sure this was what you wanted, that I wasn't just convenient, a means of escape." Julia placed her palm against his cheek. "You are my escape, Finn Fitzgerald, but you're so much more than that. You're the first person in years to see me really see me. To ask what I want instead of telling me." He turned his face to press a kiss into her palm. "And what do you want, Julia?" "Freedom," she answered honestly. "And then? A chance to discover what might be between us without fear or obligation." Finn smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. "That sounds perfect to me." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Julia. Hidden away in the mountain cabin, she and Finn existed in a world of their own making. During daylight hours, he taught her to shoot his father's old rifle, insisting she be able to defend herself if necessary. They fished in the nearby stream, gathered wild berries, and repaired the cabin's aging roof. At night, they talked for hours by the fire. Julia shared stories of her childhood before her mother's death, happy memories she hadn't allowed herself to revisit in years. Finn spoke of his dreams for his ranch, the herd of prime cattle he was slowly building, and his plans to expand once he had the capital. They slept separately, Finn on a bedroll near the fire, Julia on the cabin's only bed, but their stolen kisses grew longer, deeper, as trust and affection blossomed between them. Never once did Finn pressure her for more, seeming content to let their relationship unfold at her pace. On Sunday evening, the night before the hearing, a knock at the cabin door startled them both from their quiet conversation. Finn immediately reached for his rifle, signaling for Julia to move behind him. "Who's there?" he called, approaching the door cautiously. "Sheriff Taylor, Mr. Fitzgerald. Judge Wilson sent me." Finn cracked the door, keeping his body positioned to shield Julia, and found the aging sheriff standing alone in the gathering dusk. "Sorry to disturb you," Sheriff Taylor said, removing his hat. "The judge wanted me to warn you Blackwell's brought in a lawyer from Denver. Fancy fellow with a reputation for winning ugly cases. They're planning to claim Mrs. Blackwell is mentally unstable, prone to fabrication." Julia stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "That's absurd. There are people in town who have known me my entire life." "Yes, madam, and several have already agreed to testify to your character," the sheriff assured her, "but you should be prepared for a difficult day tomorrow." "We will be," Finn promised grimly. "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff." After Taylor departed, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Julia paced the small space, her earlier calm evaporating in the face of this new threat. "He'll twist everything," she said anxiously. "Make me sound hysterical, unreliable, and who will the town believe?" A powerful man they depend on for their livelihoods, or a foolish girl who ran away in a blizzard? You're not foolish, Finn said firmly, catching her hands to still her pacing. And you have evidence, remember? Your journal. What if it's not enough? Finn considered this seriously. Then we'll leave, he decided. Tonight, if you want. We can be halfway to Wyoming territory by morning. The offer tempted her to simply flee, start fresh somewhere beyond Blackwell's reach. But Julia knew she would never truly be free unless she faced this challenge head-on. No, she said finally. I need to do this. I need to stand up to him publicly, for myself. Finn's expression softened with pride. Then that's what we'll do, together. Morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect late autumn day in the Colorado foothills. They rode into Golden just as the church bells were chiming 9 o'clock, the appointed time for the hearing. A crowd had gathered outside the town hall, drawn by the promise of drama involving one of the area's most prominent citizens. Julia held her head high as Finn helped her dismount, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed them through the crowd. Inside, the town hall's largest room had been arranged court-style, with Judge Wilson seated at a table on a raised platform. Horace Blackwell already occupied a table to the left, a sleek-looking man in an expensive suit beside him. That must be the Denver lawyer, Finn murmured as they took their places at the right-hand table. Before Julia could respond, the judge called the room to order. This is a hearing to consider the petition for annulment filed by Julia Zimmerman Blackwell against her husband, Horace Blackwell, he announced formally. As this is not a criminal proceeding, I will allow both parties to present their cases directly, though Mr. Blackwell has chosen to have legal representation. Mrs. Blackwell, are you prepared to proceed without counsel? Julia stood, her voice surprisingly steady. I am, Your Honor. What followed was the most grueling day of Julia's young life. She presented her case, first explaining the circumstances of her marriage at 15, Blackwell's agreement to delay consummation, and his increasingly threatening behavior that had culminated in her desperate flight during the blizzard. She submitted her journal as evidence, along with testimony from Martha Reynolds about her physical condition upon arrival at the church, bruised, terrified, and clearly fleeing for her life. Blackwell's lawyer, a Mr. Harrington, cross-examined her relentlessly, attempting to portray her as confused, possibly delusional, and certainly ungrateful for the generosity her husband had shown in marrying her and rescuing her family from financial ruin. And where has your father been during all this supposed mistreatment, Mrs. Blackwell? The lawyer asked silkily. Has he expressed any concern about your welfare? Julia swallowed hard. My father and I have been estranged since my marriage. Indeed, how convenient. And now, we find you've run away with a young ranch hand, a man with every reason to resent Mr. Blackwell's success, given his own humble circumstances. Objection, Finn called out, rising from his seat despite having no legal standing to do so. That's not a question, and it mischaracterizes my relationship with both Mrs. Blackwell and Mr. Blackwell. Judge Wilson's mouth twitched slightly. This isn't a formal trial, Mr. Fitzgerald, but you make a valid point. Mr. Harrington, please limit yourself to relevant questions. The lawyer inclined his head in acknowledgement. Very well, Mrs. Blackwell, isn't it true that you agreed to this marriage, that you consented before witnesses? I was 15, Julia replied, her voice tight. My father made the decision. I had no choice. Yet Colorado law allows marriage at that age with parental consent, Harrington pointed out, which you had. The law may allow it, Julia said, finding her courage, but that doesn't make it right. A murmur ran through the crowded room, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. When Blackwell finally took the stand, His performance was masterful, a concerned husband, worried for his young wife's mental state, patient beyond all reasonable expectation. "Of course we consummated our marriage," he claimed smoothly, directly contradicting Julia's testimony. "Not immediately, I grant you. I was considerate of her youth, but certainly within the first year her claims otherwise are." He shook his head sadly. "Simply not true." "And these alleged threats?" his lawyer prompted. Blackwell looked appropriately pained. "Completely fabricated. I've never raised a hand to Julia, never even raised my voice. Ask anyone who knows me, I'm not that kind of man." On and on it went, each side presenting witnesses to support their version of events. Townspeople who had seen Blackwell treat Julia with apparent respect in public. The Blackwell household staff, clearly intimidated, claiming they had never witnessed mistreatment, but admitting under Finn's questioning that Mrs. Blackwell and Mr. Blackwell maintained separate bedrooms. By late afternoon, tension in the courtroom had reached a breaking point. Judge Wilson called a brief recess before final statements, allowing Julia a moment to step outside for air. Finn followed, his face tight with concern. "He's lying through his teeth," he said quietly, once they were alone in the small garden behind the town hall. "But he's convincing, Julia. And his lawyer is twisting everything." "I know," she replied, fighting back tears of frustration. "It's my word against his, just as we feared." "Maybe not," came a gruff voice from behind them. They turned to find Jacob Zimmerman, Julia's father, standing awkwardly at the garden gate. He looked older than his 45 years, his face haggard from hard living, but his eyes were clearer than Julia had seen them in years. "Pa," she whispered, hardly believing he was there. "I've been sitting in the back," he explained, not quite meeting her eyes, "listening to everything. Listening to that man lie about you." Finn stepped forward. "Mr. Zimmerman, are you sober?" Jacob nodded grimly. 62 days now, thanks in part to you, Fitzgerald. The work helps." He turned his attention back to Julia, his expression crumpling with shame. "I did you wrong, daughter. So wrong. Sold you to that man because I was too weak to find another way. Too weak to be the father you deserved after your mama died." Julia's throat tightened with emotion. "Pa, no, let me finish," he insisted. "I've been a coward long enough, but I won't be a coward anymore." He straightened his shoulders. "I'm going in there to tell the truth, all of it, about the arrangement I made with Blackwell, about what he promised regarding your marriage bed." Hope sparked in Julia's chest. "You would do that? Testify against him?" "I would," Jacob confirmed. "It's years too late, but I can at least do this much. Be a father instead of a drunk for once." Inside, the courtroom fell silent as Jacob Zimmerman took the stand. Few in Golden had seen him in months. He'd become something of a recluse since his daughter's marriage, emerging only for necessary supplies and the occasional bottle. "Mr. Zimmerman," Judge Wilson said, surprise evident in his voice, "you wish to offer testimony in this matter?" "I do, Your Honor," Jacob replied, his voice stronger than Julia had heard it in years. "I need to set the record straight about the agreement between myself and Horace Blackwell when he married my daughter." From his place at the table, Blackwell shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with his lawyer. Jacob spoke plainly, without embellishment. He explained his desperate financial situation after the drought of 1874. How Blackwell had approached him with an offer that seemed too good to refuse marriage to Julia in exchange for enough money to save the family homestead. "But I wasn't completely without conscience," Jacob continued, shame coloring his voice. "I made one condition, that he wouldn't. That the marriage wouldn't be consummated until Julia turned 18. I told myself that made it better somehow, selling my 15-year-old daughter to a man more than 30 years her senior." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilson leaned forward. And Mr. Blackwell agreed to this condition. He did, Jacob confirmed. Said he was mainly interested in having a young wife to manage his household and improve his social standing, that he could be patient regarding the other aspects. Do you have any proof of this agreement? The judge pressed. Jacob reached into his worn jacket, withdrawing a folded document. I do. This here's the contract we both signed. Specifies the financial arrangement and the condition regarding consummation. The judge accepted the document, examining it carefully before looking up with narrowed eyes. This bears what appears to be Mr. Blackwell's signature, along with yours, Mr. Zimmerman, and it explicitly states that the marriage will not be consummated until Julia Zimmerman's 18th birthday. Blackwell surged to his feet. That's a forgery. I never signed any such agreement. It's not a forgery, Jacob insisted. We signed 2 copies, one for each of us. This is my copy, which I've kept these past 2 years. Your Honor, Harrington interjected smoothly, even if this document is genuine, which we dispute, it has no legal bearing. A husband's rights within marriage are established by law, not by private contracts. Judge Wilson's expression hardened. I'm well aware of the law, Mr. Harrington. I'm also aware that contracts entered into in good faith have standing in this court. And if Mr. Blackwell did indeed agree to these terms, then his testimony today about having consummated the marriage would constitute perjury. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Blackwell's face had gone an alarming shade of red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This is absurd, he spat. The word of a drunk against mine. I'm the most respected businessman in this county. A drunk who kept a legal document safe for 2 years, the judge observed dryly, and whose testimony aligns with his daughter's journal entries and the observations of the household staff regarding separate bedrooms. The judge studied the contract again, then looked at Jacob. I need to verify the authenticity of this document. Do you know if any witnesses observed its signing? Jacob nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Sheriff Taylor witnessed both copies. That's his mark there at the bottom. All eyes turned to the sheriff, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom throughout the proceedings. He rose, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Is this true, Sheriff? Judge Wilson asked. Sheriff Taylor sighed heavily. It is, Your Honor. I witnessed both Mr. Zimmerman and Mr. Blackwell sign those contracts. Mr. Blackwell asked me not to discuss the specific terms with anyone, said it was a private business arrangement. Given his standing in the community, I agreed. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. Judge Wilson's face was stern as he surveyed Blackwell. It appears, Mr. Blackwell, that you have not only lied to this court about the nature of your marriage, but you attempted to use your influence to suppress evidence. This casts significant doubt on all your testimony. Blackwell looked around wildly, seemingly searching for some escape route. Finding none, he rounded on his lawyer. Do something. Harrington stood, his smooth manner somewhat diminished. Your Honor, even if such an agreement existed, it doesn't change the fundamental legal status of the marriage. Mrs. Blackwell remains bound by her vows. Not if those vows were entered under duress, by a minor whose consent was coerced, the judge countered. And certainly not if the marriage was never consummated, as both Mrs. Blackwell and her father attest, and as your client effectively confirmed by signing a contract agreeing to delay consummation. He shuffled the papers before him, his decision clearly made. In light of this evidence, I am granting the petition for annulment. This marriage is dissolved, effectively immediately. Mrs. Blackwell, or rather, Miss Zimmerman, is free to go. Relief crashed over Julia like a wave, leaving her light-headed. She gripped the table for support, feeling Finn's steadying hand at her back. Furthermore, the judge continued, his gaze hardening as he looked at Blackwell. "I am referring this matter to the district attorney for consideration of perjury charges. Sheriff Taylor, please ensure Mr. Blackwell remains available for questioning." As the implications of this sank in, Blackwell's composure finally shattered. "This is outrageous," he bellowed. "You can't do this to me. I'll appeal." "I'll have your position for this, Wilson. Remove Mr. Blackwell from my courtroom," the judge ordered calmly. As the sheriff and his deputy escorted a still protesting Blackwell out, Julia found herself surrounded by well-wishers townspeople who had known her since childhood and who seemed genuinely relieved at the outcome. Through the crowd, she spotted her father standing awkwardly to one side. Excusing herself, she made her way to him. "Thank you, Pa," she said softly. "What you did today, it made all the difference." Jacob's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "It was the least I could do, Julia. Far too little, far too late." "It's a start," she offered, hesitantly reaching for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, rough and calloused but steady, no longer shaking from drink or desperation. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," she acknowledged honestly, "but you have a chance to earn it now." "If you want to," Jacob nodded, a flicker of hope crossing his weathered face. "I do, more than anything." Finn approached them then, respectfully keeping a slight distance. "Judge Wilson says the paperwork will be ready tomorrow. You'll need to sign it to make the annulment official." Julia nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her freedom. After 2 years of captivity in a loveless marriage, she was her own person again. The possibility was dizzying. That evening, as the three of them shared a simple meal at the town's small hotel, Julia found herself watching Finn across the table. He had risked everything for her: his reputation, his safety, potentially even his ranch if Blackwell had prevailed and sought revenge. Later, when Jacob excused himself to turn in early, Julia and Finn walked together through the quiet streets of Golden. The autumn night was crisp, stars blazing overhead in the clear mountain sky. "What will you do now?" Finn asked after they had walked in comfortable silence for some time. Julia considered the question carefully. "I'm not entirely sure. I have my freedom, which still feels unreal, but I have no home, no money of my own." "You have options," Finn pointed out gently. "Your father seems sincere in his desire to make amends. You could return to the family homestead, help him rebuild." "I could," she agreed, "and perhaps I will eventually, but first—" She stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "First, I think I need to discover who I am outside of being someone's daughter or someone's wife." "I need to find Julia." Finn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That makes sense. You've never really had the chance to do that." "No," she said softly. "I haven't, but I'd like to try now." They resumed walking, the silence between them comfortable yet charged with unspoken possibilities. "You know," Finn said finally, "my ranch has a small cabin, more of a bunkhouse, really about a quarter-mile from the main house. It's not much, but it's private. Separate. It could be a place for you to stay while you figure things out, if you wanted." Julia glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Fitzgerald?" He returned her smile, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "I suppose I am. The ranch is growing. I could use help with the books, planning, that sort of thing." "You've got a good head for numbers, I remember that from school." "And you wouldn't mind having me around?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes searching his face for the truth. Finn stopped again, turning to face her fully. In the silver moonlight, his expression was completely open, vulnerable in a way few men ever allowed themselves to be. "Mind, Julia, having you around would be." He shook his head, apparently struggling for words. "I care for you. More than I probably should, given everything you've been through. But I want you to know that if you accept my offer, There are no strings attached, no expectations, just a safe place to find yourself and a friend who believes in you." Warmth bloomed in Julia's chest, a feeling so different from anything she'd experienced with Blackwell that it took her a moment to recognize it as genuine affection, perhaps even the beginnings of love. "What if I want strings?" she asked quietly. "Not now, but someday." Finn's breath caught audibly. "Then someday, when you're ready, we can talk about strings, all kinds of strings, but only when you're sure it's what you want." Julia nodded, a decision crystallizing in her mind. "I accept your offer of employment, Mr. Fitzgerald, and the cabin. And the friendship." She stepped closer to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "And the possibility of someday." Finn's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that held promise without demand, passion without pressure. When they parted, Julia felt lighter than she had in years, perhaps lighter than she ever had. For the first time in her memory, the future stretched before her not as a sentence to be endured, but as an adventure to be embraced. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and discovery for Julia. True to his word, Finn provided her with the bunkhouse cabin and meaningful work, managing the ranch's accounts and correspondence. The distance between their dwellings gave her the independence she craved, while their daily interactions allowed a natural friendship to deepen into something more. She reconnected with her father as well. Jacob Zimmerman remained sober, working steadily for Finn while rebuilding the family homestead that had fallen into disrepair. The relationship between father and daughter remained fragile, marked by moments of awkwardness and lingering hurt, but also by genuine efforts at reconciliation on both sides. As for Horace Blackwell, his fall from grace was swift and complete. The perjury charges were only the beginning once his business practices came under scrutiny. Numerous other improprieties came to light. By Christmas, he had sold his holdings in Colorado and departed for parts unknown, leaving behind a community that quickly discovered it could thrive without his oppressive influence. Winter settled over the Colorado foothills, transforming Finn's ranch into a landscape of pristine white. On Christmas Eve, he invited Julia to dinner in the main house, their first truly private celebration together. She arrived to find the small cabin transformed. Evergreen boughs decorated every surface, their fresh scent mingling with the aroma of roasting turkey. A fire blazed cheerfully in the hearth, and the table was set with Finn's best dishes, mismatched but carefully arranged. "This is beautiful," Julia breathed, taking in the effort he had clearly made. "Not as beautiful as you," Finn replied, helping her remove her heavy coat. Julia smoothed the skirt of her new dress, dark green wool that she had saved for weeks to purchase. At 18, nearly 19 now, she had grown into her full womanhood. No longer the frightened child bride, she carried herself with quiet confidence earned through hardship and survival. They enjoyed the meal Finn had prepared, talking and laughing with the easy comfort of two people who had come to know each other deeply over the past months. When they had finished eating, Finn looked suddenly nervous, fidgeting with something in his pocket. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "A Christmas gift." Julia accepted it with a smile, carefully untying the string. Inside was a small leather-bound book, blank pages waiting to be filled. "A new journal," she said, running her fingers over the soft leather cover. "For your new life," Finn explained. "I thought maybe this one could hold happier memories than the last." Tears pricked at Julia's eyes. "It's perfect, thank you." "There's something else," he added hesitantly. "Something I want to ask you, But I need you to know that you can say no and nothing will change between us if you do." Julia's heart quickened. "What is it?" Finn took a deep breath, then reached for her hand across the table. "These past months, watching you heal, watching you discover yourself, it's been an honor, Julia. You're the strongest person I know, the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." He squeezed her hand gently. "I promised I would wait until you were ready, and I meant it. I still mean it. But I also need you to know that I love you. I think I have since that day I saw you standing on your father's porch, facing an impossible situation with more dignity than anyone should have to muster at 15. Julia's breath caught in her throat. "Finn, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I'm not asking for a declaration in return. I just wanted you to know where I stand, that my feelings for you are real and deep and in no way dependent on your response." But Julia was already moving around the table, drawn to him by a certainty that had been building within her for months. She stopped before him, taking both his hands in hers. "I love you too," she said simply. "Not because you rescued me, or because you've been kind to me, though you have been both those things. I love you because you see me, all of me, and you respect what you see. You don't try to change me or control me. You just love me, as I am." Joy transformed Finn's face. He stood, drawing her gently into his arms. "You're sure? Because there's no rush, Julia. We have all the time in the world." "I'm sure," she confirmed, sliding her arms around his neck. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want, and it's this. It's you." Their kiss was different from the ones they had shared before, deeper, more certain, no longer constrained by doubts or fears of moving too quickly. When they finally parted, both breathless, Finn rested his forehead against hers. "I have another question," he murmured. "One I've been wanting to ask for a long time." Julia smiled, already knowing what was coming. "Then ask it." Finn stepped back just enough to look into her eyes, his own shining with love and hope. "Julia Zimmerman, will you marry me? Not now, not until you're completely ready, but someday. Will you be my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "But not someday, Finn. Soon. I don't want to wait any longer to start our life together." His answering smile was radiant. "How soon is soon?" Julia considered this, wanting to be certain her decision came from a place of clarity, not impulse. "Spring," she decided. "When the snow melts and the world is new again, that's when I want to become your wife." "Spring it is," Finn agreed, pulling her close again. "Though I warn you, it's going to be the longest winter of my life, waiting to make you Mrs. Fitzgerald." Julia laughed, happier than she had ever imagined possible. "Mine too. But we've both proven we know how to wait for what matters." They were married on the first day of May, 1878, in a simple ceremony on Finn's, now their ranch. Judge Wilson officiated, visibly pleased to be joining together a couple whose love story had begun in his courtroom. Julia wore a dress of pale blue silk, her father proudly walking her to meet her groom beneath an arch of spring wildflowers. As they spoke their vows, Julia thought of how different this marriage was from her first. She was no longer a child, but a woman of 19 who knew her own mind and heart. The man before her was not a stranger who had purchased her, but a partner who had earned her trust and love. And the promises they exchanged were not empty words, but commitments they both understood and freely chose. That night, in the main house that was now their shared home, Julia experienced the true meaning of marriage for the first time. Finn's touch was gentle, reverent, his patience infinite as he showed her that physical love could be beautiful rather than frightening. In his arms, she discovered joy she had never imagined possible, healing the last wounds of her past. In the years that followed, the Fitzgerald ranch prospered. Finn's careful management and Julia's sharp business acumen proved a formidable combination. They expanded their holdings, built the larger house Finn had always dreamed of, and became respected members of the community known for their fairness to workers and generosity to those in need. Jacob Zimmerman remained sober, eventually remarrying a kind widow from town and finding a measure of peace in his later years. Though the scars of the past never fully healed, he and Julia forged a new relationship based on mutual respect and forgiveness. Children came first: a son they named Michael, then twin daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth. Julia proved a natural mother, her own difficult past giving her exceptional empathy and wisdom in raising her children. Finn, too, excelled as a father, his gentle strength providing security while his playful nature filled their home with laughter. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the Colorado foothills in shades of gold and crimson, Finn took Julia's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, the question a ritual between them on significant occasions. Julia considered the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the terrified 15-year-old bride sold to a man she feared, to the confident woman of 29 who had helped build a thriving ranch and family. "Not one," she replied truthfully, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led me here, to you, to our children, to this life we've built together." Finn pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm the luckiest man in Colorado." "And I'm the luckiest woman," Julia countered, smiling as their youngest daughter came running across the yard, pigtails flying, with a wildflower clutched in her small hand. As they welcomed their child onto the porch, showering her with praise for her flower-picking skills, Julia felt a profound sense of completion. The girl who had once been forced to marry at 15 had found her way to true love and happiness, not through a rescue, but through her own courage and the patience of a man who had respected her enough to wait until she was ready. Together, they had written a love story worthy of the wild, beautiful land they called home, a story of redemption, resilience, and a love that had been worth every moment of waiting.